China's illegal police station in New York City shut down, but what about the Chinese consulates? Two lawmakers pushing for a new bill aiming to do just that and boot Chinese diplomats out of America. But it wouldn't be the first time. The Chinese consulate in Houston was shut down under the Trump administration years ago. Do you think Congress will pass the new bill? Let us know below and subscribe if you haven't already.
This program is brought to you by Preserve Gold, the #1 precious metals IRA provider. Call 855-962-3322.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Shutting down the Chinese consulate in New York City and sending diplomats back to China. That's what a new bill is pushing for. This comes amid the controversy of Chinese police stations operating on U.S. soil. Congress members Tom Tiffany and Lance Gooden are the bill's lead sponsors. If passed, the Chinese consulate and the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in New York City would be forced to close their doors. Congressman Tiffany says the move is to prevent Beijing from stepping on America's toes.
Now's the time to tell them to stop. And the best way to do it would be to say very clearly, we're going to close this consulate in New York City. And the people that were involved with this, that are in the Communist Chinese Party, they're going to get sent back home.
This comes after the U.S. arrested two men over allegedly opening and operating a Chinese police station in New York City. The FBI already shut down one, but reports from human rights group Safeguard Defenders shows 6 more are still running on U.S. soil.
I mean, we're even finding them in the heartland in, Minneapolis, not too far from where I live, as well as in Nebraska.
As well as in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Houston. That's also according to Safeguard Defenders. Beijing operates a network of over 100 similar police outposts in other countries. Chinese authorities say these offices help overseas Chinese with their passport services, but human rights groups say otherwise.
Well, one of the things that they do is they intimidate Chinese nationals that are in this country. And that's really antithetical to the open, free country that we aspire to be.
The bill also looks to close the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in New York, citing Beijing's growing influence over Hong Kong. But it wouldn't be the first time. The Chinese consulate in Houston was shut down under the Trump administration years ago. The National Republican Senatorial Committee released a new ad blasting Michigan lawmaker Elissa Slotkin. The congresswoman was found to have signed a hush agreement linked to a Beijing-backed battery company and to have helped keep the project out of the public eye. Here's more.
Can we trust a politician who makes secret business deals with companies backed by the Chinese Communist Party? Of course not. But that's what Elissa Slotkin did.
The ad accuses Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin of covering up deals with Communist China. The company in question is called Gotion, a subsidiary of Gotion High Tech. It's based in Shenzhen, China's southern metropolis. Last year, Gotion proposed setting up a $2.4 billion electric vehicle battery plant in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A spokesperson confirmed new details to Fox News in April that Slotkin signed a non-disclosure agreement over closed-door discussions about the Gotion project. Those talks, in Slotkin's words, aimed to understand the project's impact and if there were ways to help from the federal level. At the same time, the Gotion plant has been facing intense scrutiny for its direct ties to Beijing. The company's bylaws require it to carry out Communist Party activities in accordance with the Constitution of the Communist Party of China. In a March interview with Tucker Carlson tonight, former candidate for Michigan Governor Tudor Dixon shared her concerns.
It clearly states it has to be the Chinese Communist Party setting up in the middle of the country. So you have a lot of opportunity to spy on the United States if you're right in the center of the country, and they're writing, clearly stating that they are spying on the United States.
Joseph Sella, former U.S. ambassador to Fiji, noted Slotkin's background as a former CIA analyst and Defense Department official. He told Fox News that Slotkin knew state officials were warned not to sign deals with companies linked to Beijing.
She knows well the grave national security threat that the PRC presents to the CCP, and it's unconscionable that she would even begin to think about signing a binding and punitive non-disclosure agreement with the state of Michigan in order to bring a PRC-based and a CCP-tied manufacturer to the heartland of Michigan.
Sella described the agreement with China as subnational incursion.
They're a national security threat, and it's a toe in the door for future espionage operations to happen, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks with the 6 police stations that were found and the 40 police agents of the PRC and the CCP that were arrested in New York.
Slotkin's office declined to comment further on the non-disclosure deal. Meanwhile, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has pushed for $715 million in incentives for the Goshen proposal. That plan includes $175 million in taxpayer funds, greenlit by a Michigan Senate committee last month, plus a 30-year tax break estimated at $540 million. The funding is part of the Biden administration's efforts to bring electric vehicle production back to America. And Goshen isn't the only beneficiary in Michigan. Ford is also partnering with Chinese battery maker CATL to build another battery factory in the state. That project is on track to get nearly $1 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act, since the plant will be owned by a U.S. company. Altogether, the 2 battery plants will garner close to $2 billion in subsidies from the state of Michigan. Peter Hoekstra, former U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, sounded a warning about the proposals. He said the U.S. is enriching China's battery industry at the expense of opportunities for American companies and for companies in allied nations.
I think there are lots of people in America. There are lots of people and companies in countries that are allied with us, whether it's in Europe, whether it's Korea or Japan or Australia, that are more than willing to put together proposals to take advantage of that $1 to $2 billion.
Hoekstra cautioned that Chinese companies could take advantage of loopholes in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Ford said, well, we're not partnering with them. We're just licensing their technology. That's to get around trying to get around the rules and find a loophole that allows them to become eligible today.
Hoekstra formed the Michigan-China Economic and Security Review Group to look into Chinese investment in the U.S. The panel suspects that hush deals involving Goshen might violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The rule requires certain disclosures of foreign-linked entities. The panel has asked the DOJ to investigate.
Canada may soon out a Chinese diplomat from its borders, and Beijing is protesting. It all started with a Beijing official getting accused of targeting a Canadian lawmaker and his family. According to the Globe and Mail newspaper, Beijing had sought information about Parliament member Michael Chung's relatives who may be in China. Chung is part of Canada's main opposition Conservative Party and has voiced opposition toward the Chinese regime. The Globe reported that Beijing targeted him in a likely effort to make an example of this MP and deter others from taking anti-PRC positions. Now, Ottawa says all options on the table to address that matter, with Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly adding earlier that she was assessing different options, including the expulsion of diplomats.
My deputy minister right now is meeting with the Chinese ambassador and summoning him.
Chinese Ambassador Cong Pei-wu quickly denounced that statement. On Thursday, he, quote, protested strongly against what he called a threat. He also accused Canada of turning the situation political. One day earlier, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also chimed in. He says he found out about the intelligence report from the newspaper and blamed the spy agency for not passing it on to him at the time. Chung responded to that Thursday, saying Trudeau's national security advisor told him the intelligence went to Privy Council office, which supports the Prime Minister and his cabinet in 2021. The 2023 World Freedom Press Index is out, and China has dropped down to the second lowest ranking on the list. That's just one spot above North Korea. And experts accuse Beijing of exporting its system to other countries. More on this from NTD's Malcolm Hudson.
China has dropped down to one of the lowest World Freedom Press Index rankings, coming second only to North Korea. It's the world's biggest jailer of journalists and one of the biggest exporters of propaganda content. But China's media control efforts aren't limited to its own borders. Fiona O'Brien, the UK Director for Reporters Without Borders, said China is seeking to export its system abroad.
What China has done in Hong Kong is to rip up the British-Sino Treaty that was arranged in the 1980s pre-handover, and in complete disregard for that, to trample on its obligations to press freedom. Its laws are extraordinarily restrictive, and its ambition is to export the model that it currently uses in China to other territories, including Hong Kong.
Since Beijing introduced the national security law in mid-2020, the situation in Hong Kong has declined dramatically. The law means authorities can punish people for vaguely defined crimes, for things such as subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. But Beijing has the power to decide how the law is interpreted. Editor for BBC News Chinese, Howard Jiang, said a Chinese official called the law a hanging sword.
When the Chinese government pushed out the national security law, one of the officials did say, we're not going to use it every day, but it will be like a hanging sword over your head. And if you offend, you'll be punished by the full force of the law.
He said that over the last 5 years, and in regards to press freedom, Hong Kong has gone from relatively free to strictly controlled. Business news and non-political news still has some freedom.
But anything that's politically sensitive, and I would say self-censorship is becoming a new norm. Most journalists would know what not to say, almost becoming as sensitive as mainland colleagues.
During the 2019 Hong Kong protests, hundreds of journalists were detained, indicted, and were victims of police violence. In 2021, a dozen journalists were arrested in a new wave of arrests, the same year that 2 major independent news outlets were forcefully shut down. More than 5 others chose to shut down too due to concerns around risk. O'Brien said the toolkit used by oppressive regimes is expanding and largely linked with advances in technology.
Vietnam brought in internet laws which were mirroring those of China a few years ago. There's a training centre for journalists right on the border with Vietnam, so China is very much trying to propel itself through the region and beyond.
She added that the international community needs to take measure of what's happening and work together with other like-minded nations to combat China's ambitions before it's too late. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
China is once again boosting its presence in the South China Sea. Chinese state-run media announced yet another military drill, this time with its landlocked neighbor Laos. This upcoming drill marks the regime's latest effort to bolster regional ties within the South China Sea in an attempt to counter U.S. influence. Just recently, China concluded joint drills with Singapore in international waters in the same area. Back in February, China's Defense Ministry sent a working group to Laos, Vietnam, and Brunei for talks on regional security issues, with a focus on bilateral defense cooperation mechanisms. Meanwhile, Taiwan is watching closely as Beijing seeks to boost its regional influence. On Thursday, the island carried out its annual civilian drill with a focus on a potential attack from its communist neighbor China. The exercise usually aims to raise readiness for natural disaster and wartime scenarios. But in the face of an ever more hostile China, Taiwan is stepping up its game. Taipei's mayor saying,
"Since the war in Ukraine, we have seen the international and regional situation change, so we have to make related preparations."
For decades, the Chinese Communist Party has seen the democratically governed island as its own territory. That's despite never having ruled it. That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 2 years. Here's what to look out for in our second half. More on the Chinese police outpost in New York. How does it connect to a certain network of overseas Chinese operatives known as Tongs?
When the CCP launched its operations to begin creating basically overseas operations of the Chinese Communist Party, then they understood the Tongs where you have to go to get that done. And so they started what they call liaison work. And as they win over the support of the Tongs then have to start serving the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And the CCP, of course, uses those networks as a form of infiltration into foreign communities. They'll invite, for example, anybody of influence on trips back to China. They'll also use the Tong members as tools for, industrial espionage and things like that. The Tongs, for example, will go and mobilize, bus around people to vote and stuff like that. And you could even say to an extent it's possibly interfering with the elections. It's real serious stuff.
Joshua Phillips, senior investigative reporter at the Epoch Times, has been investigating the issue for years. He's even received several death threats over his work to expose it. The full episode is available on our partner platform, Epoch TV. To sign up, click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.
A performance that truly matters for each and every one of us. This is what you've been waiting for. See it at least once in your lifetime. Get tickets now at shenyun.com.